Alright guys, we are back to add another piece to our Unit 11. This week we are doing the 1960s, which is part 2 to Unit 11. I just want to take a quick look, like we have been, at the calendar for this week. Remember, this is just a recommendation, it's not a demand. So day 1, which we're at right here, you would do the review PowerPoint, listen to the review video. You've got the review guide for this week. There's 16 questions that goes along with this PowerPoint. Then you have a discussion response. This week you're going to be talking or reading, I guess, about the rights of the accused from Supreme Court decisions. And both of those assignments, your review guide and your discussion response, are due by Thursday at 11:59. Don't forget, Thursday. All right, so we're going to start with segregation in America. As I like to do, we're going to start with a little review. What do we know about segregation in America so far? First, let's go all the way back to sharecropping and tenant farming. We've got to go way back to post-Civil War America. What happened now that we don't have slavery? That's when we really see segregation, or formal segregation, begin. Sharecropping and tenant farming were two ways to keep African Americans from moving away from plantation life, which aided in segregation. We didn't want African Americans to come into and assimilate into everyday life, so we found a way to keep them in the role that they had been for so long. Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were put into place following the Civil War as a formal way of segregating. That's these famous pictures that you see over here, the drinking fountain, white and colored, swimming pools, grocery stores, restaurants, everything white only, colored only. And of course, if we're talking segregation, we have to talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was the case that legalized segregation with that ruling of separate but equal being constitutional, and that's going to be your picture over here, because we know that when Plessy versus Ferguson said separate was equal, separate is not equal. And of course, if we're reviewing segregation, we have to talk about the discrimination that African Americans faced in both the North and the South. African Americans are going to become active members of the United States, fighting in the Spanish American War, fighting in the First World War, the Second World War, risking their lives for freedom of people from other countries, but not being able to be accepted back at home. And that's really going to drive this movement. So we have to start with a court case, Brown versus Board of Education. So let's start with a little story here. Oliver Brown was the father of a young girl who was being forced to walk to school. Now I know that doesn't sound so bad, but this little girl who was walking to school was having to cross through terrible neighborhoods, over train tracks, and going a very far distance to attend an all-colored school when there was a perfectly good white school right around the corner. She would pass that all-white school on her way to the bus stop that would take her to that faraway African American school. So Oliver Brown, because of these conditions that his daughter was having to face just to get to school, is going to sue the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, saying this separation is not equal. Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer from the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is going to fight this case in defense of Oliver Brown all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what they're going to argue is that separate was not equal. It was inherently unequal to have a separation. Chief Justice Earl Warren, which we're going to talk about later, is going to be appointed to the Supreme Court during this case. This case is going to result in a 9-0 decision, which means all 9 justices agreed that this case together, they made the same decision together unanimously. And what they ultimately do is strike down Plessy versus Ferguson. And the court says separate but equal was unconstitutional. A year later, we're going to see the court rule in a second case of Brown against the Board of Education that local school boards have to desegregate with what we call all deliberate speed, so that these kids can start going to school at a school near them, not based on what color their skin was. Also, a part of the civil rights movement, we're going to see the Montgomery bus boycott. You guys have heard of this one before. This is not news to you. In 1955, you have Rosa Parks, who, background information, was a secretary for the NAACP, a civil rights activist group. She is going to refuse to give up her seat to a white passenger, which broke the segregation laws in Montgomery, Alabama, on the buses, and she was arrested. Now, what maybe we don't know is that Rosa Parks did this on purpose. She knew she was going to break this law. She knew she was going to be arrested. And the reason for this was to advance the civil rights movement. Because of this arrest, you're going to see civil rights leaders organize what we call a bus boycott. Now, we know a boycott means you don't buy something, you don't use something. This boycott was a plan for African Americans to refuse the entire bus system because they believed that if they boycotted the buses, that the segregation policy would be changed. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be a minister of a Baptist church where this organization of the protest began. From 1955 to 1956, look at this number, 50,000 African Americans are going to boycott the buses. What are they going to do instead? They're going to walk, they're going to ride bikes, they're going to do carpools, anything to avoid the buses. And what this does is it hits the bus system in the pocketbook. It gets their attention. And in 1956, the Supreme Court is going to rule that bus segregation was unconstitutional, so the movement achieves their goal. This boycott and the success of this boycott is going to encourage a new generation of civil rights leaders, because of the success, because it's not that there was no violence, but this protest was peaceful. They got what they needed. They did it in a way that was respectable. And now we say, okay, if this is the way we attack the movement, then maybe we'll get the results that we need. Another big piece of the civil rights movement was the Little Rock Nine in 1957. So we just talked about Brown v. Board. That case said we've got to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed. Well, that didn't give a date to do it by. That didn't say how long schools had. So you see schools taking a very long time, especially in Little Rock, Arkansas. The high school board says, okay, 1957, we have got to follow this federal court order to desegregate. The governor of Arkansas, who has the funniest name possible, Governor Orville Faubus, is going to say, no, I don't like this. I don't want the schools to desegregate. And he's going to mobilize the National Guard. And what he's trying to do, and this is going to sound ridiculous because it was ridiculous, is he's trying to bar 9 African American students from entering the high school. 9 students. Think of you and 8 other friends trying to go into school and the National Guard coming to stop you. The National Guard is going to be removed with a court order, because they're not supposed to be there. They're not supposed to stop these kids from going to school. But when the National Guard is removed, in comes the angry mob of people who are against the desegregation of school. Eisenhower, this is the point that we need to pay attention to. Eisenhower says You have to uphold the federal law. And if you're not going to do it, I am going to force you to do it. So what Eisenhower does is he dispatches federal troops to protect the Little Rock Nine and to patrol the high school for the rest of the year. When Eisenhower does this, he acts as commander-in-chief. Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, is so angry about federal troops coming in, these 9 African American students going to the high school, that he shuts down public high schools for 2 years. And what this does is it really just forces many white students to go to a private school. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is going to be passed, and this law establishes a Civil Rights Commission. And the point of this commission is to make sure that things like what happened in Arkansas aren't happening, that the rules that the federal government is putting into place are being followed, and that hopefully there's a transition. It won't be seamless, but there will be a transition from segregation to desegregation. We've got a new frontier to talk about. Let's first start with the election of 1960. With the election of 1960, we've got to think about what happened in the 1950s. We said in the last part of this unit that almost every home had a TV now. That TV being in every family's living room is going to change the results of the 1960 election. Because in September of 1960, CBS is going to air the first presidential debate. And I want you to turn to this picture up here. Not quite the debate stage that we see today, but what happened at this debate is you had John F. Kennedy, the Democrat, versus Richard Nixon, the Republican. Kennedy's going to walk onto the debate stage, sun-kissed from a vacation, welcoming the stage makeup, which my stage kids are going to know that if you're on stage under those lights, you've got to have makeup. He's going to look young because he's only 43 years old. He is young. He's the picture of youth. And then over here you have Richard Nixon, who is older, who refuses the stage makeup, who is a touch sick from the election campaign that he's been running, and he looks sweaty, he looks nervous. And as people are watching this, they don't see the candidates. They see the actions of how they react to these questions. And Kennedy is cool, calm, and collected, and Nixon is a sweaty mess. So what we really see on that stage is John F. Kennedy, the young 43-year-old Irish Catholic being the first and only president of the United States to be Catholic. He's going to be a representative and a senator serving from Massachusetts. His chosen vice president is Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson is going to be from Texas, which, if you look down here, Texas is usually a Republican state. But because Kennedy chose Johnson, who was from Texas, Texas votes Democratic. Also on that stage, you're going to have Richard Nixon, who should have been a lock for this. He was the vice president to Eisenhower for both terms. He's going to have served in Congress for over 10 years as a senator. He knows how the government runs. He knows what's going on in the government. He became famous for his role in the House of Un-American Activities Committee, those hearings, and finding the communist Alger Hiss in the United States. Nixon should have had this in the bag, but he didn't. And in this largest voter turnout in the country's history, we're going to have a very tight race between Kennedy and Nixon, but Kennedy is going to come out winning by less than 120,000 votes out of 68 million votes cast. So Kennedy slides by, and a lot of people attribute that to this television aired debate. So what influenced this election? The TV. So what is this new frontier that I'm talking about? A new frontier is very similar to the New Deal, to the Square Deal, to the Fair Deal. This is Kennedy's domestic program. This package of programs that he wants to pass in order to advance the country. And what he's aiming at is the economy, how to assist the poor, and where the package gets its name from is the space program. Space is the new frontier. We've got to go beyond Earth and into the sky. So, what were the goals of the new frontier? We want to raise minimum wage. Man, oh man, could you imagine it being 125? But it was appropriate for the time. He wanted to provide more aid to education, expand Social Security, get medical benefits for the elderly, and support for public housing. This domestic program that Kennedy wants to put in place shows that he's a true Democrat because he wants the government to get involved in social problems. Think back to the New Deal. FDR, the Democrat who stuck and buried his head as a government official, the president, in social problems. Kennedy wants to do the same thing, showing this is the new Democratic Party. We will not shy away from social problems. We are getting involved to fix them. So as president, you're going to see Kennedy pass the Equal Pay Act. All this simply says is that if an employee does the same work in the same place as another employee, they should get the same pay. He's also going to pass the Housing Act of 1961. This is going to take care of those poor neighborhoods, urban renewal. Remember, in the last part of this unit, we talked about how everybody was moving from the cities to the suburbs. When they moved, they took their tax money. The cities were falling apart. This Housing Act is going to put money into the cities. During Kennedy's presidency, stock market looks great. It reaches its lowest levels since 1929. So we got a tank coming in. Kennedy says, "I'm going to fix the stock market. We're not going to sink into a Great Depression." What he proposes is a tax cut over 3 years. What this does, when you cut people's taxes, people have more money in their pocket. When they have more money, what do they do with it? They spend it. So Kennedy says, stock market's not looking so good. I'm going to give the people more money with a tax cut that's going to stimulate the economy. And if we look at where Kennedy's attention really was, it's going to be space. In May of 1961, we're going to see Alan Shepard from the US make a 15-minute flight at an altitude of 115 miles in the sky. He doesn't orbit the Earth, but that's still a huge advancement because remember, we're competing against the Soviet Union after the launch of Sputnik. We believe that we're very far behind. So, JFK says, no, we're not so far behind. I think we're going to have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And the way we're going to do that is through NASA. And NASA's going to get $500 million in the beginning, but under Kennedy, that number goes up to $4.5 billion. We are in a space race. We want to get to the moon. Kennedy was right. By July of 1969, Neil Armstrong's going to walk on the moon, and we are going to get there. JFK on foreign policy. You guys know what's coming here. The Bay of Pigs. You've talked about the Bay of Pigs in global, but we've got to come back to it for the United States perspective. Cuba is going to be controlled by the communist leader Fidel Castro beginning in 1959. The United States, not a big fan of Castro, and in fact, the U.S. is going to refuse to accept Castro as a legitimate leader. Reason being, when Castro comes into power, he takes control of all private and foreign-owned plantations and corporations. This includes any business interests that the U.S. had down in Cuba, which essentially is cutting the U.S. out of the tobacco industry, and things like that, which is taking money from us. So how do we retaliate? The CIA is going to begin training a group of Cubans down in Cuba whose goal was to invade and overthrow Castro. Now, this plan was supposed to be backed by the United States. Not only are we supposed to train this group, but we are supposed to work alongside them. And we were expected to help the people of Cuba overthrow Castro. April of 1961, 1,400 of the CIA-trained Cuban exiles land at the Bay of Pigs. What they find is they're no match for the Cuban troops. Kennedy sees what's happening and he says, it's not really worth the effort. I'm not going to send down the air support that was promised to these people. And because he sees the mission as a hopeless effort, he doesn't help. So what happens? When the airstrike doesn't come to destroy the Cuban air forces that these Cuban exiles were up against, the mission fails. What ultimately happens, though, is a major embarrassment of the United States. The United States just showed that it tried to overthrow a leader in a country that they didn't like. This is something that the Soviet Union had been doing forever. When they didn't like a leader, they overthrew them and they put somebody in power that they liked better. That's exactly what the United States was doing in Cuba, and it's something that we were saying the Soviets were bad for doing. So essentially, we are big old hypocrites, and this causes JFK's popularity to decline because the Cubans in the United States are not going to like JFK because of this. So I love this political cartoon over here because the Bay of Pigs, represented by the Cuban cigar, blows up in the face of Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs is going to lead directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro is going to beg the Soviets for protection from the United States. In October of 1962, a U.S. spy plane is going to reveal that the Soviets were coming to build missiles in Cuba pointed directly at the United States. In response to finding out this information, JFK orders a quarantine of Cuban waters to stop the missiles from being installed. So this results in missiles being pointed at the United States, people of the United States being absolutely fearful for their lives because they expected nuclear warfare to begin. This very well could have led to a nuclear war. After 6 days, the closest 6 days that we have to coming to a nuclear war, Kennedy and Khrushchev come to an agreement. And the United States says, we will stay out of Cuban affairs and we will remove the missiles from Turkey that the United States had pointed right at the Soviets. And the Soviets agree that they're going to remove the missiles from Cuba. But the importance of this event is not the letters that were exchanged or the agreement that we came to. It's the absolute fear that the Americans lived in for 6 days. This is because of nuclear warfare. Had we not had these advancements in technology, this fear wouldn't have been so bad. But we learned in Cuba, 90 miles away, missiles were pointed that could kill millions of Americans at a time. The effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis are huge. The Cuban Missile Crisis is going to lead to an effort to reduce nuclear war. We don't want nuclear war to actually happen. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved that it could happen, and it definitely should not. A hotline is going to be established between the US and the Soviet Union to allow for the leaders of the two respective countries to communicate quickly so that we don't have 6 whole days where we're fearful for our lives. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is going to be passed. This is huge. It's going to be signed by the US, the Soviets, and the Great Britain, the big three from World War II, and the two superpowers. What this test ban treaty says is that you cannot, it is banned from happening, test nuclear weapons above ground. The reason that we're doing this is we're trying to eliminate that radioactive fallout. Think hills have eyes. The radioactivity from testing these weapons is bad for humans, animals, the environment, and it doesn't just dissipate. It takes decades to heal from the radioactive fallout. So the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is literally what it says. Nuclear tests are banned. The effects of the conversations between Kennedy and Khrushchev is good for Kennedy. It makes him look like a hero to the American people. It makes it look like the US stood up to the Soviets and that we didn't get pushed around. And the reason for that is the information about the US taking missiles out of Turkey was never really made public knowledge. What was made public knowledge was that Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba. So Kennedy turning around the embarrassment from the Bay of Pigs to make the Democrats look good for the upcoming elections in Congress. There are going to be other efforts by Kennedy to try to contain communism. His Alliance for Progress, which was meant to be helpful in Latin American countries to counter those revolutionary movements that could result in communist governments. What Alliance for Progress did was promote peaceful revolutions. The United States tried to prop up and build stable governments. But this program isn't really going to get off the ground. It needed millions of billions of dollars, and there just wasn't enough money or support for it. But it's A for effort by Kennedy. The conference at Vienna was meant to be between Kennedy and Khrushchev in dealing with the happenings in Germany. But what this does is it doesn't ease any tensions between the two leaders. It actually increases them. And a major result of this meeting was the construction of the Berlin Wall. And what also happens, we build the Berlin Wall, not us, but the Berlin Wall was built. Military presence was built up on both sides of the Berlin Wall, and Kennedy's going to ask Congress to increase military spending. So the conference at Vienna, while it was supposed to kind of come to an agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, actually puts more fuel on the fire and creates the Berlin Wall, which is the symbol of the divide between capitalism and communism. It's the symbol for the Cold War. The end of an era. I know you guys know what's coming. The assassination of JFK. In November of 1963, Kennedy is going to travel to Dallas, Texas to start to begin rallying support for his reelection campaign. In Dallas, he's going to be seen in this famous picture riding in the convertible in a parade, waving at people, really just trying to get his face out there for the reelection. Lee Harvey Oswald is going to fire on the president's motorcade from a building on the route of the motorcade. And that's going to end up killing the president. Now, I know that there's a million different videos out there, and if we were in school, we'd be talking conspiracy theories, but this video is getting really long, so I'm going to keep going. Just know that it makes me sad that we're not talking about these conspiracies together. Lyndon B. Johnson is going to be sworn in as the next president before even leaving Dallas. We didn't know what was happening. The president just got assassinated. We didn't know if it was an attack from the Soviets. We didn't know if there were more attacks coming. So Johnson's going to be sworn in before he even gets off the ground. 2 days later, When being moved to a different jail cell, uh, Lee Harvey Oswald is going to be shot by Jack Ruby. And it actually was on TV. That's what this picture is down here. The whole nation was watching what was happening, and Lee Harvey Oswald coming out of the jail to be moved. He hadn't even gone on trial yet. We didn't even know really why he did what he did. And Jack Ruby does what everybody in the United States wanted to happen. And he shoots Jack Ruby, uh, or Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald, and it gets caught by news cameras. Because of the way this all happened, Johnson is going to put together what's called the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. What they're going to find is that Jack Ruby acted alone. It wasn't some big conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't a part of, something, a greater plot of the Soviets to take down the United States. But in 1979, the commission is going to change their tune, and this is where the conspiracies come out of, where they say that there may have been more than one shooter that day that the president was killed. We don't know who that was. And that's where your conspiracy theories come from. So Johnson as president, so we've seen now, bear with me, we had the square deal, we had the New Deal, we had the fair deal, we had a new frontier, and now we're going to have a great society. All of these are presidential programs. The Great Society is Johnson's agenda. His goals are to carry out what JFK wanted in regards to civil rights, tax cuts, public education, and medical care for the elderly. The phrase that goes with the Great Society, the goal of it was to declare war on poverty. We wanted to get rid of poverty in the United States. Johnson is going to believe that the budget deficit in the federal government, which means that there was more money than what we needed, could be used to improve the economy. The examples of how we attack poverty in the United States start with the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The goal of this program, tackle illiteracy and unemployment. How are we going to do it? Through work training programs, and this created the Head Start program. Head Start was used originally to give people a place to find childcare in order to go and work. Childcare that would begin a baseline education to really kickstart an education for children while their parents went out and worked. The Economic Opportunity Act, also known as AmeriCorps, is also going to help attack poverty. What this does is it's going to send people into poor communities for aid. Today, a lot of teachers go into AmeriCorps. It's a program where you go and teach in inner city or low income areas. And you can learn to become a teacher there. They're government funded jobs, and the ultimate goal is to help poor communities. This was supposed to pair with the Peace Corps program. AmeriCorps is when you go in the United States to poor communities. Kennedy's Peace Corps was when you were going to communities around the world to provide aid. So the same idea, but AmeriCorps does it on our own soil. Kennedy's Peace Corps did it around the world. Now we get to the big ones. The Great Society is going to tackle the idea of Medicare, or not Medicare, medical health insurance for everybody. How do we take care of the people in our country in their medical needs? Johnson finds a solution. In 1965, Johnson's going to pass two huge, and I mean this huge, like the guy in the commercial, huge programs through Congress. The first one is going to be Medicare, which provides provided hospital and low-cost medical insurance to most Americans over 65. This is still in place. Medicare is the insurance that you get when you hit over 65. Medicaid was meant to be health insurance to poor Americans of any age that cannot afford their own health insurance. So wait. Why do we care about health insurance? Think about it this way. If you don't have health insurance and something happens to you, even something small like breaking your arm, you fell down, you broke your arm when you were rollerblading, if you don't have health insurance, you have to pay out of pocket the x-rays, every doctor's visit, the emergency room bill, the cost of getting your cast put on, the cost of getting your cast taken off, any physical therapy. You have to pay for that all out of pocket. That could be thousands of dollars. With insurance, though, you have some coverage. You don't have to pay every penny out of pocket. Insurance covers some of it, and you may still have a bill. It's not total coverage all the time, but it's a heck of a lot better to pay $100 than it is to pay $10,000. So that's why these two programs were put into place. People need health insurance. Medicare over 65, Medicaid under 65, health insurance for everybody. During this time, we're also going to see people start to think about protecting the environment and the consumer. The reason being, first, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. If you ever get a chance to read it, it is incredibly interesting. It's going to turn the people's attention to environmental damages caused by pesticides and fertilizers. That's going to cause the government to start to look at environment. How do we conserve, how do we take care of the planet that we're living in as a direct result of Silent Spring? Ralph Nader is going to write the book Unsafe at Any Speed. Believe it or not, there used to be a time where there was no seatbelts, no airbags, no safety features whatsoever in cars. Ralph Nader writes a book about how unsafe cars used to be, as if it weren't common sense. And that book is going to lead to the passing of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, where we come to look at how do we make cars safe? How do we make the roads safe so that people aren't dying in these cars that we all now have? Ultimately, the Great Society makes us realize that all poverty cannot be wiped out. It is impossible no matter what we do. And ultimately, the Great Society isn't going to fully be able to take on poverty because of Vietnam. Vietnam is going to cost money because it's a war, and we're going to go over that in the final part of Unit 11. But because of that, the Great Society programs are going to have money taken away from them, and we lose, I wouldn't say complete loss, but we don't get to defeat poverty in the U.S. If you're still listening to me, we only have 2 more slides left. The Warren Court, and I'm going to make this short, I promise. The Warren Court is known as the most liberal court in American history. When we look at the Warren Court, the goals under Chief Justice Earl Warren, who is right here, was meant to support civil rights, support civil liberties, support voting rights, support personal property through the decisions of the court on cases presented. We've already seen one case under Chief Justice Earl Warren, and that's going to be Brown versus Board of Education, and that's going to fall into the civil rights category. Like I said, the Warren Court is under Chief Justice Earl Warren. The comparison has been made, and you're going to read a little bit about this for your discussion response this week, to compare the impact of the Marshall Court, which was the first Supreme Court that really made advancements, defined what the powers of the Supreme Court, remember judicial review, defined what the role of the Supreme Court was. The Warren Court is going to overturn many old laws and rulings and set new legal precedents or examples, which we saw in Brown versus Board of Education, where Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned, and we saw a new precedent being set where segregation was unconstitutional. The Warren Court wanted to protect the people and their rights from the government. And the most controversial part of the Warren Court is they were protecting the rights of the accused. Accused, we're going to find, were the criminals. Let me point out to you just a few of these major court decisions, and then I promise I am done. The first one, Miranda versus Arizona of 1966. This is going to be a case where a man with the last name of Miranda, it's not a woman, was arrested and it was interrogated for many hours, ultimately admitted to a crime and was found guilty of that crime, but he was never told his right to remain silent, his right to a lawyer, his right to have a lawyer provided to him if he couldn't afford one, and that they did not have to answer any questions and could have those rights. Because of that, even knowing this guy was guilty of a terrible crime, he was let go. And the courts say, okay, we cannot let this happen again. So the Miranda warning was created. If you are arrested and the Miranda warning is not read to you, the entire case can be thrown out. And that comes from this case right here. Mapp versus Ohio. This case is incredibly important because a woman by the name of Dalry Mapp was arrested after police came into her house and found incriminating materials that were not allowed to be searched for because they didn't have a warrant. So even though she was guilty of what they found, the evidence could not be used because the warrant that the police suggested they had and later was found they didn't have didn't cover what they found. So this case says that police have to have a warrant, that warrant has to be specific, and if they find something that is not on that warrant, even if it's incriminating, it cannot be used in a court of law. Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. This case, a man by the name of Gideon, last name Gideon, was found guilty of a crime, didn't have enough money to hire a lawyer. The court did not let him know that he has the right to have one appointed to him. He tried to defend himself in his case and was ultimately found guilty, but he challenged that guilty verdict because he didn't have proper legal representation. This case is going to find that it's a fundamental right of the people to have an attorney present to protect them in the court of law. And ultimately, Gideon is going to be let free because his due process rights were violated. Now, the one that sticks out that isn't really criminals is Engel versus Vitale. What this case finds was that it has to deal with school prayer. So we're looking at this picture down here. A little boy's father brought to the attention of the school that the children should not be forced to say a prayer if they don't want to, if it doesn't go with their religion, it should not be forced upon them. That was regular practice in the 60s. Saying the pledge, saying your prayer, those were just things that you did in school. Engel is going to sue all the way up to the Supreme Court, and what will be found is that the government, which is what schools are, they're representatives of the government because they're federally funded, should not endorse any particular belief because it can lead to wars, prosecution, and other destructive measures. So Engel versus Vitale says No prayer in schools. Now, if you've hung with me this long, please just one more minute and I promise I'll be done. Remember, you've got a review guide, you've got a discussion response. Both of those are due by Thursday at 11:59. If you have any questions about all of the material I just went over, please feel free to email me.